Greetings. Thank you for joining us for our podcast, Achieving Business Success in a Virtual World. I'm Tim Bajarin, Chairman of Creative Strategy, one of the oldest high-tech research and consulting companies in Silicon Valley. I've been involved with major clients like IBM, Dell, HP, Lenovo, AMD, Intel, etc. for almost 40 years, working at both the research and the strategy level. With me is Barton Goldenberg, who is the president of ISM. He is known as one of the top authorities in CRM. He's written 3 books on the subject. Some of his clients are clients like ExxonMobil, AAA, T. Rowe Price, Johnson & Johnson, and Land Rover, to name just a few. One of the things that Barton and I have been doing for the last 2 to 3 years have been focusing on research on the whole concept that started with Mark Zuckerberg's vision for the metaverse, although the concept of VR has been around since the 90s. But Mark Zuckerberg basically elevated the term when he put out his vision and then renamed his company Meta. Now, in our mind, when we look at the term metaverse, we've become a bit frustrated, like a lot of people, because it seems to have too many meanings. But it appears that it's coming down to the whole idea of being able to take a real world experience and translate it into a virtual world experience. Now, let me have Barton come in and just introduce himself and give you a few notes in his thinking about business success in the metaverse.
Thank you, Tim, and greetings to all of you. So my name is Barton Goldenberg, as Tim said, president of a company out of Bethesda, Maryland. It's a suburb of Washington, D.C. that's focused for the last 38 years on applying leading edge technology to support customer strategy with a particular focus on sales, marketing, and customer service. So what has excited me about the metaverse from a business perspective is the potential to create disruption in existing markets and really take customer experience, customer engagement, sales, service to a whole new level. And what I've found particularly interesting, Tim, on the metaverse is the whole concept of 3D. And to me, from a business perspective, that's the breakthrough. And I'd actually, we'll talk about it a little bit more, but I'd like your perspective on why 3D is so important, and then I'll share mine with you.
The idea of 3D is to bring out the images so that they are more lifelike and realistic. And even though it might be in the form of a VR avatar for communicating, and the environment may be drawn as opposed to represented, at least in the VR sense, it really represents, I believe, a big part of the next generation of how we communicate, how we work, and how we learn. One other thing that I want to point out is that I have studied user interfaces for 40 years, and I was heavily involved when Apple introduced the Mac, and we began, especially with the project on bringing desktop publishing to the US and the world. And in both of those cases, it was very clear that windowing type user interface, a la the way the Mac brought what we would call the graphical user interface into the mainstream, was the next big thing in user interfaces. And that has evolved now to the point where we also have touch in smartphones and in tablets. But moving that metaphor forward, I believe that what we're going to see in the next big bump in user interfaces is going to be related to VR and AR. And that will be where we'll bring in gestures, hand movements, eye tracking, etc. But seeing those images, both in an AR sense, which is your real world, and in a virtual sense, where it's a 3D image, is really stunning. And the more Barton and I actually play with VR headsets and some of the AR stuff we've tested, we are totally convinced that this is the future of the next generation interface of how we will interact, not only in business, but with consumers and our friends and mates.
Tim, I'll take that a step further on the 3D side. So thank you for, giving us that insight. But what has impressed me on the 3D side is, particularly if you get into the virtual world and you have an opportunity to be immersed within an environment, and you can take an object and look at it in 3 dimension, turning it, looking at it, or even using AR glasses, the ability to look in a 3D perspective. If you're a neurosurgeon and you want to do brain surgery, when you're in a VR world, you're able to then see the exact overlay of the tumor on the brain so that you can accurately turn the head and the brain in different directions and really notice where is the tumor and cut it out beautifully. In the business, on a more business side, if you're able to look at a particular problem, and let's just say it could be in a different part of the world, through a common set of augmented reality glasses, and look at a service problem and be able to pull up the manuals or recommend how something could be fixed because you're looking everything in 3D, all of a sudden you're seeing the world very differently, and you can really begin to reduce costs, speed up the ability to get something fixed, etc. So that whole 3D is really fascinated me. And I might add the 3D for all of us that have played Pokemon Go or any of the other games that you might have played. I mean, they're fun too. 3D puts a whole new fun factor into the way we do our business and spend our lives.
When you think about AR and VR and MR and XR, as they call it, we're looking at really a brave new world. I mean, we're looking at an area where it's very clear that this represents a new opportunity and a new vision for how we work, learn, and play. Now, granted, we are in the earliest stages of it. Even though it's been around for over a decade, we're in the early stages of this. But this podcast has a real reason to exist in that we believe that businesses need to begin seriously looking at this now. And that's why we had this vision for this podcast. And over the next, months or so, Barton and I will be working pretty heavily in our discussions to not only explain the technologies that are going to be done, and we'll update you on new things every other week in the hardware and software space, but we will also start sharing with you case studies of people who are really using it already. And I tell you, that's been a game changer for me, where I watch it being used in field service and training. I mean, this is not something that is just, a vision. This concept of VR especially, and to some degree, some of the AR stuff, is already being done. And each week we'll bring a new case study to the table.
Tim, I'd like to pick up on that. I earlier talked about the importance of technology disruption in industries. And we talk in this podcast on achieving business success in a virtual world. The virtual world is the disruptive technology. It is that 3D. It is the virtual, augmented, or mixed, or even extended reality. But if we think for a minute about disruption in an existing industry because of technology, or disruption because of a new technology, it can be a very powerful impact on how a company does business in the future. And just think for a moment about what Apple was able to, how the technology of Apple replaced that of BlackBerry, or the impact of Netflix that they had on blockbusters, or the impact of Amazon on border books, or the impact of Uber on the yellow taxi, or the impact of Canon and some of the other digital cameras on Kodak, or the impact that Tesla's now having on the automotive industry, or the impact that Airbnb is having in the hotel industry. And in all of those cases, Tim, it's technology that has disrupted the game. And as Blockbusters knows only too well, the impact can be swift and painful unless you're living in that virtual world, in my perspective, in 5 years' time. Blockbusters was a $12 billion company, a $5 billion company in 2007 when Netflix brought on the streaming service. It went bankrupt 5 years later in 2012. And here's the scary part. The forecast is that half of the S&P Fortune 500 companies will actually be replaced in the next decade because of disruption. But the good news is technology can help you transform. And that's why I'm a great believer, for reasons that you've already begun to explain and we'll explore throughout this podcast, that the metaverse or XR, AR, the virtual world technologies, they offer that disruption opportunity. And any company that wants to kind of stay alive in the next 5 years has to understand from a customer perspective why this is such an important technology and why this will be a disruptive technology and why they have to adopt it.
Yeah, and I would add that you add what's going on in artificial intelligence to AR and VR, and you're going to see a exploding new way of using AR and VR in business. I recently wrote a piece for Forbes where I talked with the author, talked with John Chambers, former CEO of Cisco. And I have known John and listened to him for decades, and he's been one of the greatest technology forecasters I've ever seen. He's been right every time. And he points out that the reason that big companies are going to jump in with AI is because in the end, it's going to be cost savings. It's going to allow them to tremendously save costs on everything they have to do, including customer service, sales, etc. I believe that we take that a little bit further. I think that you add AI to the VR, AR, XR experience, we're going to see an amazing amount of innovation. And one thing that excites me about this area, and this has always been a trend, and I've written about this for over 3 decades, but when a new technology comes out, a lot of times we don't even know how people are going to use it. We don't know what they're going to do with it. And one of the great examples was the original IBM PC and the Apple II. At first, we were in the mini computer age, but once these two came out, and the VisiCalc actually was the first tool that just changed the market, that a PC could be a financial and analytical tool that asks the what if question. And that started with the Apple II and VisiCalc, and then eventually to Lotus 1-2-3 with IBM. And all of a sudden, the software industry was born, and it revolutionized the PC as a tool. We're now starting to already see that within the context of AR, AI, and VR. The software community is doing a great deal of work to create products. And Barton and I will be speaking at AWE in June, and we'll be at that conference in Santa Clara, California, where you're going to see hundreds of new applications that are being done both in hardware and software that shows that this industry is continuing to advance. Now, having said that, Barton, as we talk about what folks are going to learn going forward, why is it they need to be thinking about it now instead of 5 years ago or 5 years in the future, or say 3 years, where it probably is going to explode?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tim. So there's a couple of, I call them burning issues. And I think the most important one is the consumer, the millennial, and particularly Gen Z. So Gen Z, 1997 to 2012, and millennial, more in the kind of 1981 to 1996. But these are two generations, particularly again Gen Z, that have grown up largely playing video games and living in some form of a virtual world. It's a part of who they are. They're not the type that are going to go open a bank account and use checks. They're going to do everything online. They're not, everything is done from an online and a virtual perspective. They are going to be driving the future, and they're here today. They're in jobs that are making decisions, that are buying products, that are requesting service, and they are today, and they are requesting that today. So the customer is increasingly demanding that companies respond to the way they would like to do business, and they would like to be in a virtual world using some of the capabilities for service or sales, field services you've mentioned, et cetera. But you've already mentioned one that's another burning issue, and that is lowering the cost for field service. And all of the studies now are showing when you're using augmented reality, and in some cases even virtual reality, you can lower service costs by up to 75%. That's today. So the classic example is the rig in the North Sea, north of Scotland, and they had to put a special part on an oil rig, and they weren't sure if it was going to fit perfectly. And so what they did is they did everything in virtual reality. They created the actual, it was a crane that was being used, and they tried it on the rig in virtual reality, and it didn't fit, and they adjusted it, and then they brought it back out to the rig, saving themselves tens of thousands of pounds in that case to get the rig right. But the whole concept of lowering costs today can be very important. You also mentioned training. When you go to places like the Mayo Clinic, where all of the students, their medical students, are obliged to use virtual reality and augmented reality as a part of their curriculum to learn how to work in a laboratory, for example, or how to use a particular piece of equipment. We're looking at achievement of up to 60% improvement in training content recall and retention today. And if you look at the cost of onboarding people, particularly professionals and technical people, it can be very expensive and very long. Using virtual reality, today you can train them in weeks instead of months, and the retention rates that I already talked about can be achieved. So the urgency is that your customer is demanding it, and that you can save money, on the whole servicing side. On the sales side, by the way, it's a whole new channel. One of the things that people don't talk about often is, yes, the metaverse and the technology behind it are a technology. They're platforms. You can build applications. But what's unique about the metaverse, and why I see it as the disruptor, is that it's also a channel. It's a distribution channel. It's a sales channel. It's a service channel. So people are going to go to these various metaverse sites and to do things, to buy things, to service things. And companies like Warby Parker or IKEA would be just examples of two companies that have really jumped in. And I can just speak for IKEA with their IKEA Place. So there you take an empty room, you imagine putting in all the IKEA furniture and appliances, et cetera. And you measure it out, and you can see a room right in front of you. You can adjust it, and then you can buy the furniture. Well, they've got an 11-time return on their initial investment already, and they're just a couple of years into this IKEA Place. The same thing for Warby Parker with their eyeglasses, the try-on eyeglasses. And so, you can make money today in an effective way where your Gen Z and millennial customers are happier, having a better experience, having better engagement, while at the same time, you're saving costs, you're improving training, recall, et cetera.
Yeah, and I'm with Barton, and especially the Gen Z. There's a lot of research that's gone on this particular generation who literally don't know what a phone booth looks like. They don't know about, for example, the flip phone has actually become kind of a fad with them, but they didn't even know about it. They had to go look it up to realize we had the flip phones back in the 90s. But they adjust to technology very quickly, and they're going to want that when they go in. We used to make that argument, especially when was Gen Zs then that are millennials now, that when they got out of college, they were going to demand better tools and capabilities when they got into the business world. And that's exactly what happened. It's going to be the exact same thing here. These next generation, especially Gen Z, are going to want to have and expect to have a different medium to do their work with. And especially in the case of both VR and AR, if it allows them to be more effective, they'll jump on that tomorrow. We do understand that some generations and older generations could be resistant to it, and we're seeing that already. But when I talk about why it's important to start today, it's because you've got to be prepared for these kids coming in to work in your companies. And I do think that we're at that stage right now that any company, I don't care how big, how small, has to at least start factoring in what the impact of AR, VR will be. And as Barton said, how will it disrupt their business? And you don't want to, be blindsided. So in that case, Barton, what we recommend especially is these pilot programs. Would you explain how that works?
Yeah, absolutely. So, just to pick up on what Tim said about, you don't want to be the one that is disrupted. You don't want to be the Borders books when a competitor, existing or new, comes into the market and basically eat your lunch. You don't want to be the next Xerox or the next Borders or the next, you can go through it, Blockbusters, etc. In fact, what Tim is alluding to is you really don't want to be late to the party, because by being late to the party, you're giving the opening for others to be at the party with something bigger and better. Now, what Tim is suggesting, and we practice this with our clients, we're not saying you should jump deep end into the metaverse. That's not necessarily appropriate. But what we are saying is a part of your approach, and we'll go through an 8-step approach during the podcasts, but as a part of your approach, one of the more important steps is to do some sort of a pilot, to try your idea, your vision in a virtual world. And the way the pilot works, it's typically anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks, sometimes a little bit longer, but depending upon the sophistication of it. But what it gives you is an attempt to take your vision. It could be a service vision. It could be a sales vision. It could be a marketing vision. It could be, many different visions, training, as Tim alluded to. And we're going to actually create that for you so that you can see it in real life. You can apply it and have customers come in, be it avatars or non-avatars with AR, and you're going to actually see how this plays out for you. So, you're putting an investment in of a reasonable investment. If I had to put dollars and cents on it, from 50,000 to 200,000, something like that, just to get a pilot off the ground and kind of see if this is the right thing for you and ready yourself for the bigger metaverse picture. And of course, what the prototype allows you to do is to go out to your Gen Z customers, your millennial customers, or even new customers, prospects, and see how they respond and see what they like so that you can correct it and enhance it and make a better pilot and grow a commitment to the metaverse.
Yeah. And it's important because this pilot concept that Barton and I help bring to customers is an important way to think about this as a first step, where you actually put in place a program that tests out as it relates to what your particular product or service is, and then begin using that to build the actual roadmap over the next two to 3 years. Well, we're almost out of time. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Over the next months, as we do this podcast, we're going to be giving you up-to-date information about the technology that's going each time, and we'll post every other week. We will also be giving you a full case study of someone that's already doing it. And we'll help you understand how best to integrate this technology into your business processes. Subscribe to this podcast on your preferred platform. We hope you will join us again in 2 weeks for another episode of Business Success in a Virtual World. Thanks for listening.